To my immediate right, we've got Sandra from the Global Blockchain Business Council. I will let Sandra let you know what that's all about. We've also got Richard Steeves from TrustFlight and Lucas Pinoli from Moderator. And you've got microphones in front of you, and let me just give this one to Sandra right here. And Sandra, why don't you give a little background on yourself, as well as describe who the Global Blockchain Business Council is.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here. I was actually at the Air Revolution event in London, and that was an amazing event, so I'm glad to be here in San Francisco. My name is Sandra, as Ford mentioned. I spent most of my career actually as a banker in London and transitioned to digital finance and then ultimately into crypto and blockchain over the last 8 years. And I will have to say that the journey has been long and winding. It certainly has not been a linear journey, but I now focus on blockchain for social impact. And GBBC, as it's better known, is a Swiss-based nonprofit that actually came out of a group of entrepreneurs on the Blockchain Summit in 2016 on Sir Richard Branson's Necker Island. And there's a blockchain summit that occurs every year. We just had the 5th year anniversary. And it's been a long-standing focus point around GBBC, in particular around education, advocacy, and partnership, and really promoting the business of blockchain globally, and how do you scale this thing that is nebulous, difficult to understand, and frankly has a lot of hype around it. So we basically make it practical, and we work with some of the largest companies in the world, as well as with government, regulators, and central banks. So that is in a nutshell.
Hello, and yeah, good afternoon. My background actually originally is in healthcare. I created a business that was tracking and tracing and providing outsourced services for medical device manufacturers. And as part of that, we track millions of instruments a day, ironically using legacy systems, so no blockchain in sight. When that business was sold, I then took up some work in aviation, sat on the board of a public company, and also a keen pilot. And as part of my flying career, I became a bit frustrated about the amount of paperwork that we have to go through. Just to get a flight off the ground, we have to sign 7 or 8 pieces of paper, and then we got another 3 or 4 pieces of paper afterwards that need to be signed off. And we thought that actually there might be an opportunity here to be able to create new systems, new workflow applications that have the opportunity to be able to generate data directly rather than transcribing paper systems, and then to be able to use that data to be able to create new business opportunities to disrupt or change the way aviation services are provided. And so out of that, about 2 years ago, we formed a company called TrustFlight, and we're using distributed ledger technology or blockchain technology as the backbone to provide the utility for some of the new services which we're providing. And I'll describe a little bit more of those as we go through the session.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lucas Pinoli. My background is originally in investment. Prior to joining Moderator, I was at a hedge fund based in Shanghai, where I focused on listed equities in the China markets as well as the US stock market. I also worked with institutional investors out of the United States, primarily dealing with Ivy League endowment funds, pension funds, and sovereign wealth funds. I joined Moderator a year and a half ago, and since then we've been able to create a documents management system very similar to AirData and FlyDocs. And that part of our module is for free. And attached to that, we've since accomplished integrating the front end of our solution on top of the blockchain layer, similar to my colleagues here, when we primarily did an engine maintenance overhaul with the consortium out of the Middle East as our first POC. And we will be continuing to expand our product throughout the years, and I'll delve a little bit more into that.
Great, well, thank you. Like a lot of people in the room, I don't know a lot about blockchain. It's pretty much what I read in The Economist, FT, and Wall Street Journal, and I find it confusing, and sometimes I confuse the underlying platform blockchain with some of the products out there. So rather than try and reinvent the wheel and have everybody explain what it is from a technical perspective, I was just hoping, Sandra, if you could give everybody a little quick overview of what it is, what it isn't, and really, at the end of the day, what problem it solves. and sort of other insights you might have that the group here would be productive to sort of set the stage for some further questions.
So I would imagine most people have heard the term Bitcoin, and most people stop right there. It's like drug money. Is it used for evil things? There's a lot of misnomers, but let's just put all of that hype aside for a second. Just think about what it was first created for. A peer-to-peer cash electronic system where you don't have a bank in between. That's all it was, but all it is. And it still exists today, almost 11 years on. So put that aside for 1 second. That is the genesis for what we now all call blockchains and DLTs. It's basically, we now have had a plethora of evolution and change and development of the underlying blockchain.
What's a DLT?
Distributed Ledger Technology, DLT. So here's the thing. We've had cryptography forever. Not forever, but decades. We've had distributed systems for decades. We've had lots of these concepts that have been now put together under this blockchain DLT moniker for quite a while. And a lot of it is actually very math and non-emotional, meaning if you need to share information securely amongst a vast group of people and you don't necessarily trust each other, how on earth do you share that information? It's actually, at its more fundamental level, a very boring, transparent, audit, risk mitigation network, tool. I actually call it a risk mitigation instrument. And most people kind of look at me like, blockchain's what? Yeah, it's kind of this boring ledger system that allows you to share information more securely, if it's done properly, in a way that allows you to transmit that information in a way across distributed systems. So if you believe that, then you could say to yourself, all of the pain points that you talk about with the paper and the shuffling around, you could still just use a database, but there's actually a reason why you don't use just a database. You use potentially a blockchain solution because you can then embed all sorts of other applications on top of this data sharing, which includes automated smart contract functions, which means you automate certain processes over and over and over again. You can embed payments layers, so potentially if you tokenize something, and we'll talk about some of these if you want to, you could embed a payments layer that fits right into your blockchain solution. It's the additional advantages of the applications that could sit on top is for why people are now looking at this blockchain DLT baseline. So hopefully you get a sense of why when someone says to you, just use a database, why maybe you don't use a database.
Let me ask you maybe a stupid question, but I've read recently a lot about quantum computing and how it's going to break cryptography. If I understand what you just said, you indicated that cryptography is one of the pillars of this technology. So what happens when quantum computing blows that out of the water?
That debate's come forth numerous times. There's actually a lot of advances to combat quantum computing, but I feel like that's a whole nother discussion to be had. But SHA 256, those of you who are cryptographers, it's still the golden standard. And frankly, there's a lot of work being done on whether, in fact, quantum computing is near or far. And actually, there are lots of systems now looking to combat quantum computing. So
nothing we need to worry about right now.
Debate
at least
remains.
In my lifetime, probably.
Debate remains.
So, Richard, what are some use cases that are applicable today and somewhat more geared towards the folks in this audience? And also, if you have a moment or two, what are more broadly some use case that people would see from society's perspective being implemented more broadly?
Okay, so I mentioned earlier that in my previous role, we used to track individual medical devices, millions a day, and we didn't use blockchain technology. And I think it's good just to set the context for that. The reason why we didn't do it is because it's a linear supply chain. So a product is born, there are multiple, usually manufacturers that contribute to that product, but it moves linearly along through the system into the supply chain, gets consumed, and it comes to the end of its life. Aviation is completely different, as we all know. When an airframe and an engine is created, it's the start of a very long journey of 20 or 30 years, where every part of that aircraft for airworthiness has to be validated by through the maintenance events, in terms of the manufacturing of parts, the reconditioning of parts. All these things have to be tracked and processed in order to keep that aircraft airworthy. And one of the things that impedes the industry today is that there's no single source of the truth. And as Sandra mentioned, one of the things that blockchain gives you is it gives you a single source of the truth of the data that's relevant to the process that you're trying to validate. So if you take serialized parts, for example, or parts on an aircraft, they come through the system as the aircraft obviously comes up for its, whether it's through a defect or whether it's through a maintenance event. And those parts come off, they usually get reconditioned, and they go on another airframe. We have experience with one of our customers that flies 787 at the moment. We get a brand new aircraft, the first thing they do is take one of the Trent 1000s off and put a second-hand one on just to balance up the risk, for example. So already that brand new aircraft has substantial changes. And at the moment, those records are stored or captured on pieces of paper. So one of the obvious use applications, which we've done already, which is put an airframe onto blockchain and track every aspect, every event that takes place with that aircraft. So we've created a digital tech log as an example. So every time that aircraft flies, if you look in the front of a cockpit of a commercial airliner, you'll see a big wodge of carbonized paper, usually. And the captain has to sign that off before each flight. It's got the data for the sector that flight's going to go on to. We've converted all that into a digital tech log, which automatically gets written to the blockchain. And so now we have a record of that flight. If there's a defect, there's a record of that defect and how it gets closed out, whether they use the MEL or not. When it goes in for a maintenance event, the maintenance event itself is recorded. All the parts that come on and off the aircraft are recorded. And so you have a sort of birth to death record of this airframe that's taking place. So the value creation here is one of being able to, in the first instance, have data that helps you understand the quality of that asset. So for example, when it comes to the end of a lease operator, you have a real-time view of what that aircraft looks like, rather than, we have one that's coming off a lease at the moment. It's a 757. It's a 10 by 10 foot room full of bankers boxes. Literally the whole room is full of bankers boxes, and somebody's going to have to go through all those records to validate that aircraft. Whereas with the system that we have at the moment using blockchain, we know exactly where that aircraft is at any one point in time, which is value enhancing but also very efficient, because when the aircraft comes to the end of its lease, it can go on to a new operator straight away. So that's one good example. Another one, and we're very close to doing it. We haven't signed the contract yet, but we're about to launch a new aircraft registry, which is based on blockchain. And again, this is ideal because all of the information that's relevant to be able to register an aircraft will already be on the blockchain. And using a smart contract, you can then have a process where the registration change is instantaneous. And if you link that up with a title company as well that's also using blockchain, and a payment system, then all of a sudden you can instantaneously change ownership and registration of an aircraft in a matter of seconds using the algorithms that support the blockchain.
You just used the word title company, and for a specific use case example, stick around tomorrow because Clay Healy will have some examples, or he has actually implemented blockchain in his business, which is a title company, and record keeping, so I encourage you to do that. We're not going to spend a lot of time on it because Clay's a lot smarter than I am and certainly a much better speaker than I am, and we'll probably cover it well and give us a little more color. But moving on, and I know, Lucas, you briefly mentioned a use case example that you had. What do you see are the greatest risks to widespread implementation of blockchain technology? Are there some problems lurking in the shadows that would prevent them from being adopted more broadly, not only within this industry and your specific use examples, but also from a broader societal perspective?
That's quite the question, but I'm going to try and answer that as best I can. I think undertaking something that has to do with blockchain, in my mind, and I think a lot of people would agree with it, is that it's quite a challenging task. In the specific case of aviation, you're unionizing, you're not intersecting, you're unionizing multiple verticals and multiple industries that are very difficult. For us, we have blockchain and also AI. Those aren't something you just get into. Same with aerospace, and then also finance. In terms of risk, if you are going to adopt this new technology, there's definitely a risk that the people who are creating it might not know what they're doing. I've seen tremendous amounts of blockchain solutions, and I know if you've ever looked at blockchain projects, I'm sure you can say that a lot of these companies genuinely may not know what they're doing. So I think that's a pretty big risk, right?
So
It would not be good. It wouldn't be good for an enterprise to adopt software and then realize, oh, this actually doesn't provide that much value.
So what you're really saying is you may have a bunch of morons out there trying to implement something they have no clue about.
The phrase that I heard used most commonly is that a lot of solutions were created to problems that didn't exist for blockchain.
So if we've got the potential for that to happen, doesn't that bring up the specter of a regulatory framework, the regulators and the government's coming in and saying, hey, wait a minute, this is so important, it's got to be regulated. And Sandra, if the regulators are getting involved, what kind of issues does that bring up, and does that slow down implementation? Does that make it more problematic, or is that a good thing? What are the issues?
Am I going to be allowed to maybe piggyback off of what he just said first?
Yeah, please go
Okay.
ahead, absolutely.
So I was at CME Group, which is the largest derivatives exchange based in Chicago. And I'll tell you one of the issues with the big enterprise trying to do blockchain. Blockchain is a collaborative technology. It requires you actually to not only come up with a problem that you actually want to solve where blockchain would make sense, but actually you need to get lots of stakeholders involved. Have you ever tried to get, at least in financial services, getting a bunch of banks and a bunch of clearinghouses and exchanges to work together? I will tell you, 6 months got wasted just arguing about who would own the IP in the network, let alone actually doing the project itself. However, 5 years on, the financial services industry actually has evolved. JP Morgan just announced it's got over 200 banks inside of its JP Morgan coin settlement payment system that's using a DLT system. So progress has been made. It just takes a while to get that network effect.
And we're just in the process of setting up. We've agreed with Digital Jersey, it's in the Channel Islands, to create an ecosystem on the island. They have the sandpit concept where they encourage big corporations to come in and use a small environment to demonstrate a technology. And we've just had an agreement with them to do that in the islands there. So everybody who's involved in aviation will be joining the platform and participating in how we design and develop the functionality that exists around DLT in order to demonstrate how the use of the technology improves the effectiveness of how the services are provided. I think the other thing that's important is that DLT or blockchain is a utility that works in the background. We're not selling this, and I think what happened in the early stages is that people were using this as a mechanism to raise money, to be honest. AI, machine learning, blockchain, those are three buzzwords to raise money these days. The reality is that you've got to be very selective about where you use that technology, and I think what we're trying to do in aviation is we're developing services which use it quietly in the background, but that's not what we're selling. We're selling actually systems that transform the way aviation is provided or serviced or regulated.
Lucas, any comments on the regulatory aspect before Sandra jumps in?
Yeah, I think the regulators, when we've gone to them and shown them what we have, they like it. And in fact, we want to be. You have to be compliant with IATA, ATA, ICAO. And speaking of ICAO, our CEO Todd was supposed to be here talking, but he's actually in Montreal right now presenting to ICAO at their general assembly. They want to, they want to get involved with something blockchain. We hope that would be with us, but they're definitely thinking about it. They know the benefits that it could bring from a regulatory aspect. They get to look at things instantaneously, knowing that it can't be changed. So I think that's a huge win for regulators.
And Sandra, any comments on the regulatory aspect before I ask you another question?
Sure. So I bifurcate the worlds because I've never seen a tech where regulators are more excited to actually get involved. And it has to do precisely with the fact that it actually could make their lives easier. Because think about it, if they are part of a network where they have access to data and transparency in real time, that's unprecedented. And it doesn't matter what industry you're talking about. Any regulated industry that could give that kind of window into regulation, the regulators are all for that. Now, having said that, the other side of the coin, and that's the problematic part that you just alluded to, which is the securities, tokenization, fundraising, or better yet, ICO. Some of you may have heard of that, the initial coin offerings. Those have obviously caused a lot of turmoil, at least with respect to regulators around what is it? Are you now basically doing securities without being regulated, and that is a whole nother Pandora's box of stuff that if you are involved in that, then obviously you're talking to the SEC and others quite regularly.
Richard?
Yeah, I just want to comment on the regulatory side as well. When we started this 2 years ago and we did the tech log, the first thing one of the regulators asked us to do in Europe is to see whether we could still print the piece of paper, actually. So there was a challenge in trying to get them on board to begin with and to explain how the technology works. But the interesting thing is that you can actually create a new gold standard in regulation in some aspects of aviation by moving, as Sandra says, away from what I call balance sheet auditing towards continuous monitoring of the services to demonstrate compliance. And we've just done this on the healthcare side here in the US with the FDA. We had a pilot set up just over a year ago where 10 sites, and we did 2 of them, moved away from the annual audit, which we're all familiar with in aviation, and went to continuous monitoring, and now that's been expanded to 60 sites across the US. And the same thing, I'm pretty sure, will come to aviation as they start to understand and have access to data which is immutable, and generates a level of transparency that's important to be able to know that things are being complied with and you're following your standard operating procedures.
So it sounds like it's a bit of an enabler in some respects of more effective regulation that's more timely as well at the same time. So Lucas, I've got a brother who, sits there and advertises to everybody and takes pride in the fact that he's a Luddite, and he will sit there and say, no technology is good technology until it's proven technology. And he's got some, there's some positive attributes in what he said, and obviously a lot of stuff that's a little nutty with it. But at the same time, how is this technology future-proof? And as I take a look at, the other day I decided at the office to go for a walk and went outside and walked by the Boston Public Library and said, I've not been in some of the odd places there, so let's walk through. I went through one room which had all the old technologies of research. I looked at the microfiche machines. I looked at all of the other technologies which just don't exist now, but you still have to be able to access a lot of data. What prevents this technology becoming tomorrow's microfiche?
I think I'm just getting the really hard questions, right?
Sorry.
Honestly, I think the best way for me to answer this it's probably not the technology itself. It's probably the company that you're going with and their ability, the management's ability for example, if it's us, let's say someone uses our technology. You're placing a lot of trust in us to obviously deliver this product that we sold you, but I certainly hope that if something else was to come out that would replace us, we would have, as a management team, the diligence and the expertise to see that coming and then implement that into a product for you. So,
and I think the other thing is that this is still early stage technology, and the reality is it's going to require investment and R&D to get it to be able to fulfill its full potential. One of the things that we're looking to do is set up an R&D unit in Vancouver to look at how we can apply DLT in aviation specifically. We do it already in other industries, but aviation I'm particularly keen on, obviously. Just coming back to regulation again, and I just want to touch on the maintenance side. There was a discussion this morning about the inefficiency for the impending shortage of engineers to work in the MROs. One of the things that would help, this technology will help to transform that particular part of the services in aviation is using DLT, because you can have, if you develop the digital task card, which is what both of us are doing at the moment, you have the ability to real-time record the events that the engineers are going through and complete the process at the end of the mechanical part because it's recorded digitally. And so you don't end up spending hours doing paperwork, which is what happens at the moment. And then once a maintenance event is completed, boxes and boxes of paper come back to be entered into a maintenance system. But using the technology that we both developed, you have real-time population of the maintenance systems, and you liberate hours and hours of engineers' time, not having to deal with the regulatory issues that are based on old-fashioned paper systems.
So what you're saying is that when I flew to Heathrow last time, there was it took them 15 minutes to replace a part. We were late departing, and it took them 2 hours to do the paperwork.
Yes. Yeah,
Okay.
that's exactly right.
Okay,
Just
great.
You have a tire change. It takes an hour and a half to change the tires, and an hour to do the paperwork, as they manually write down serial numbers on the tires and the wheels.
Exactly. Sandra, any comments on future-proofing technology here?
Yeah, so look, I look at a couple metrics. I look at job creation. So when I think about blockchain industry 5 years ago, if you had gone to LinkedIn and Googled blockchain or searched blockchain, you probably would have had maybe a couple thousand jobs. I did that the other day. You have 14 to 15,000 jobs globally just by typing in blockchain. So, job creation. Number 2, patents. If you look at the patent filings across industries related to blockchain, they have exploded. And there are companies like Boeing and Bank of America, just across industries that are filing patents. To me, it's an indicator of R&D. Now, whether they're actually going to realize those things, who knows? But the R&D of a company is a pretty good indicator of where people are thinking and where they're kind of pushing the envelope of innovation. And then finally, when I think about blockchain for aviation, it is cutting across not just the supply chain use cases. It is now Accenture announced with KLM and Air Canada. They're going to improve the customer experience by allowing you to seamlessly go through Amsterdam and through Toronto, for example, with one-touch QR code and biometrics. And by the way, it will also be GDPR compliant, where you can delete the data and it will be erased. Now, whether that all happens or not, we'll see. But these examples are proliferating.
So Lucas, is there anything that keeps you up at night that you worry this isn't going to work because of, or if we aren't cognizant of this, it's going to create a bigger problem?
You mean with the
Implementation of the technology.
Yeah. So when we go and we visit potential customers, the biggest issue seems to be blockchain is such a multi-party kind of stakeholder event that you have to have all these different companies. But even within companies, we go to very large organizations. The biggest challenge for us that keeps me up at night is making sure that all of these parties within a company can see the benefits of that. And more often than not, they can. But it's a lot of times, we are in a little bit more of a conservative industry, and so it's usually the senior management that they really have to make the tough decision here about this, because the opportunity cost of shifting software is always, it's a big conversation to have.
So along the lines of what the gentleman from the FAA said, it's also a matter of us educating the customer base and our constituency on the benefits of this technology.
Yes.
And not confusing them and make it sound more complicated than it really is.
That's a big challenge.
Okay, let's go to some questions because we've got about 7 minutes left, and I think there's some great questions here. And John Clark's, I think, is asked a really good question, which is, are aviation applications going to exist on public or private blockchains? If private, how will the right to add blocks be awarded and verified? I guess I don't quite understand the second part of that, but really what he's asking is this a public or a private function? And who should be maintaining it, and who should be responsible for maintaining it? And Sandra, since that's more your purview, you have any thoughts on that?
So I'm going to give an example of the financial services industry only because they've started 5-6 years ago and they're evolving now, and I think a lot of industries are following the same trajectory. Day one, private only. No way in hell would we ever use a public blockchain. That was the mentality. Santander last week just did a $30 million bond on a public blockchain Ethereum. Just saying, it does evolve the thinking. Having said that, there are some real specific reasons for why you need to keep things private. For example, people's identities, financial transactions, your counterparty. If there are things that you do need to obfuscate for very good reason, public chains right now do not have the right solutions around privacy and confidentiality that would meet the muster of those requirements.
Is that blockchain administered by a private company or by the government? If it's people's identities, we now know that private companies do a lousy job of maintaining people's privacy. So, the natural extension of this question is who maintains, and you can, or Richard, if you want to comment, who maintains and oversees this? A public company? Private company, or a public government or public entity?
If it's private, it all depends on which group of fellows you decide to put together into your network. Whether it's a group of government or a group of enterprises, those are the consortia that you've seen, right? And those are the ones that will determine the governance and the rules around who does what.
Now we know
and that's critical.
We know ICANN oversees the IP addresses and the essential, administration and governance of the internet. Richard, should this industry, the blockchain industry that is, create a similar governance structure so that there's got some transparency, but it's not really a government? And by the way, when we talk about government function, should it be one particular country, or should it be a multinational consortium like ICANN is, that's really private, quasi-public-private?
I think this is a question for Lucas, actually.
He's the young kid on the
Sure.
block here. He should get abuse.
That's one of the biggest questions for anyone doing anything blockchain related. I've seen, Richard, I'm not sure if you guys have thought about this, but I know for a fact that a lot of people who are trying to do what we've done have not been thinking about this. And this is, it's to be expected to a certain degree, because there is a level of altruism that's necessary if you're going to be creating a blockchain platform and solution. And so, I mean, that's the question. We haven't solved it, but we've been thinking about it a lot. Who governs this platform? We don't want to own this platform. It would be great, but there's no way. We know that it wouldn't succeed if we owned it. In our minds, it would be some kind of harmony of regulators, representation from the leasing community, from the airlines, all the way.
Just like ICANN is what you're talking about, public-private consortium.
Yeah.
Hey, Richard, let's move on to another question here. Well, I've already covered the top one. Governments have also demonstrated an ability. Yes, I think everybody has, no question. The next one I think is interesting. Any thoughts on DLT-based air traffic management, Richard? I don't really understand how that might be implemented, obviously, since I'm a Luddite here. So any thoughts you've got on that, or anybody else in the panel?
Not obviously, no. I mean, it makes sense, obviously, for aircraft to be registered on the blockchain and the operators to be registered on the blockchain so that you've got an immutable record as to what those aircraft are and who's using them. How that works into air traffic management, have to ponder on that one for a moment, I think.
Anybody, the other two, Sandra, any thoughts?
No, I mean, look, to be frank, if you're talking about efficiency in air traffic management, I would argue that actually you would want to implement algorithms to do that, and that's more AI than blockchain. But I think when we're talking about registry, keeping track of things, that's where blockchain helps a lot. You register the aircraft, it's a known aircraft, and then you track it from point A to point B to point C. It's kind of the boring stuff, the really baseline boring stuff that blockchain's really good at.
Great. Now, the last two questions, we've got 2 minutes left, are essentially what I guess the questions come around: competition and standardization. I think one leads to the other potentially, or creates competition, creates an incentive maybe not to have standardization. So what are the challenges and ways to overcome them to get different potentially competing parties participate in an aviation blockchain?
Yeah, I can add to that one, or start to address it. So data structure, I think, is important, interoperability of data. Lucas mentioned they didn't want to own the platform. I actually think the way the industry will evolve is you'll have multiple platforms, but if you get the data structure right from the outset, then you'll have interoperability and the data can transfer across multiple platforms. And I think what the aviation industry will be purchasing is the services that are provided by the companies that use DLT or blockchain as a utility, as I was mentioning earlier. So we're not selling blockchain, what we're selling is services. The data has to sit somewhere, and if the data standards are set for the industry, which is where having some form of collaboration with the regulator in particular would be important, then you can have multiple competitors in the industry.
Okay, and the third question: how does a company acquire blockchain technology for installation? Sorry, it keeps moving on me. Is the software purchased? Who develops technology? Who maintains and upgrades? Actually, good question, because we talk about this in sort of the ether, essentially, by, of course, blockchain's going to come here, but this is a good question. It's like, how? Yeah. Who wants to answer that question?
Well, we're both doing it.
Yeah. Sure, I'll start. Richard and I were just talking about this, but blockchain gets put in people's faces way too often. And I know it's ironic, our company name's Block.Aero, but it shouldn't be something that's talked about that much. It's kind of like you would never ask what version of the internet that Amazon was built on when you're shopping on Amazon, right? It's kind of like that. So what we believe blockchain is obviously it's a great storage of information, but we're using it, in fact, to facilitate transactions within the industry. Transaction is just any time an asset changes hands. And the way that we're doing that is by the blockchain supports a front end, which is the software that we've created for the users. Could be any of you guys. So you never really see a blockchain network. We've been asked, please show us your blockchain, and we don't really know how to respond to that. What it is just a front end, very UX driven user experience that interacts with a blockchain that you'll never see.
So somebody calls, essentially the answer to the short answer to the, excellent, because that's a good point, but to answer the question directly, I guess someone just calls one of you guys up and says, hey, I want to do this? Is it simple as that?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you want electronic tech log where we're writing the data to the blockchain and it gives you access to data that you could use in smart contracts and payment systems at some point in the future, call TrustFlight. If you want to do it with an MRO and engine overhaul, call BlockAero.
So we're out of time, but is there a last comment that is an important point that we haven't mentioned that you guys want to cover off very quickly? Sandra, anything?
I'm just going to have one final comment. The blockchain you use depends on what problem you're solving for. There are actually hundreds of blockchains, and not all are fit for purpose for your particular problem.
Gentlemen, any final closing thoughts or comments?
I think we're still at the early stages of this. I think once the industry starts to, we talked a lot about data this morning, and I think once the industry starts to recognize the value of having a single point of the truth on all the various aspects of data that we have in this industry, you lay the groundwork for being able to create some new interesting service models that can use that data to disrupt the way we do things today or make things much more efficient or create new services that don't exist today. You get access to all sorts of information for risk management, as an example. On fuel services is another example, which we're going to be doing in Jersey. You can instantly tender for a fuel service and pay for it instantly using smart contracts. None of the spreadsheets and all the nonsense that we have today. There's, in the insurance industry with risk management, being able to have real-time access to where that airframe is, who's flying it, how it's being flown, where it is in the world at any one point in time will change the risk models. There's all sorts of interesting things that will fall out of this, but we're at the very early stages of this journey.
So this is a conference about how this industry, the aviation industry, is changing. Would it be fair, Sandra, to say that blockchain technology can make it easier for disruptive technologies to be implemented because it may potentially reduce the amount of paperwork burden that legacy companies would have originally had to have in the industry, and that would have cost them more money?
In a world where data is the holy grail of the future in terms of how do you make it valuable, because a lot of crap data is crap data, blockchain can help actually make it more valuable in the sense of organization, securing it, having it be auditable, and being a single point of truth, and frankly, parsing out all the crap with the nuggets of gold.
Right. And Lucas, very quick last thought or comment?
I think to add to that, the room for innovation. Long term, if someone is able to develop a blockchain product and it's used by companies, long term, and I'm going to speak from kind of an investment perspective here, that company's balance sheet, their cash flow, for sure going to be affected. And I know that a large portion of this industry does operate under perfect competition. So, margins are always kind of strapped. Management is forced to be a little bit short-sighted. So if we could, give those margins some breathing room, it'll allow the opportunity for the innovative companies in the industry to use that extra cash to maybe be innovative themselves, either reinvest in their own companies or maybe invest in startups that they can bring into the aviation industry as a whole. I think long-term we'll see a lot of that too. Right.
Right. Well, I think that's obviously positive news for particularly people in this conference. So thank you, the three of you, for being here. I've learned a lot. And if anybody in the audience has more specific questions, I'm sure folks will be available later on. So thank you again.